Sue Moroney and Tim Hurdle are our commentators today. Kia ora koroa. Thanks very much for being with us.
Good morning.
Kia ora, Kathryn.
Barbie season, of course, notorious for rumours around leadership changes. So we'll see if that features at all in your looking ahead to the year and what you see as the key themes that will define the year. Sue is a former MP with Labour and now Chief Executive of Community Law Centres Aotearoa. Tim Hurdle's former National Party Senior Advisor. He was the National Party Campaign Director in 2020. He's the Director of several companies, including Museum Street Strategies, a public affairs firm. Tim, do you want to kick off with what you're looking at as some of the key markers, the key themes that will define this year, as best as our crystal balls can tell us?
Well, I think the start of the year was the National Party setting out a change in direction from deflationary policy and saying, right, okay, it's about economic growth. So the Prime Minister really set his own KPIs for the year ahead. And I guess that's what is going to be the challenge for them. We are seeing some really crazy and difficult international headwinds buffeting New Zealand too, but we have a challenge in that our economy is very flat. Interest rates are dropping, but there is still quite a flat economy out there. And so the fact is that unless we get economic growth, they won't be able to afford some of the promises they've made in elections, and we're starting to see unemployment numbers start to creep up, and the minute unemployment starts going up, that becomes a challenge for a government. And then there's the political challenge of being in a coalition government and containing the ambitions or ideas of two coalition partners. So the ACT Party is looking to break out its brand, be different, and New Zealand First's trying to be New Zealand First and looking at whether there's a leadership change there. And then you've got, on the other side of the fence, the Labour Party trying to make a case for being an alternative government. And then they'll be trying to see how do they differentiate themselves from a Green Party that is quite different and possibly on quite different issues, and then a Maori Party which has very strident and strong themes, but some economic policy which would be very frightening for the middle class that Labour wants to win back off National.
I think the economic growth phase is going to be attached to absolutely every announcement. The Social Development and Employment Minister's just announced 2 more non-financial benefit sanctions to the traffic light system, MSD's traffic light system. Quote from the statement, to drive economic growth by incentivising more job seekers to enter the workforce. So that phrase is going to make its way into everything.
That'll be in every press statement.
Well, is there a risk in hitching your hopes so much to the growth bandwagon when it typically is not a short-term result?
Yeah, and it was telling in the Prime Minister's speech that the one thing he said that we should be saying yes to was more concerts at Eden Park. Well, that was something that sat in the hold of Auckland Council and who just increased it. It wasn't a government thing that you could say yes to. And so the problem governments have is when you say, yes, we want economic growth, when you start getting into the nitty-gritty of what we can do to actually make it happen, it gets very challenging very quickly, particularly in a short-term space.
All right, so your take on what the big markers could be, what are you looking for?
Well, the government started off in a very difficult position this year, unprecedented, I believe, for a newly incoming government to actually be trailing in the polls after their first year. So, the very first poll that struck in the beginning of this year was the Curia one. Be interesting to see if these trends come up in other polls. But Labour's leading in that poll. So you see a knee-jerk reaction from the government having what seemed to be an unplanned reshuffle of their cabinet, which, brought about a whole range of interesting issues that people are quite confused about, like, why do we have a minister for the South Island? Why have we now got a minister for universities when this was a government that said it was going to get rid of bureaucracy, and it seems to be adding more layers to it? So I think they've got quite a conundrum coming up, because this year is going to be all about cost of living from the voters' perspective. And the problem that the government's just invited itself into is that having this, what they will want to be perceived as being a drive for economic growth, problem with that level of economic growth that they say that they want to deliver is that it will impact on interest rates. Interest rates will go up, And then you're actually feeding the cost of living crisis all over
They're not
again.
going to get it, Sue. You know, the Treasury growth predictions are anemic, and they're not suddenly going to leap. And the
well,
real,
look, you know,
yeah, go ahead.
they've tried, you know, their plan for addressing the cost of living crisis was giving tax cuts, and that was really their whole plan, and increasing unemployment, so sacking a whole lot of public servants. So that was their plan for addressing cost of living. That hasn't worked, and so now they're pivoting to this economic growth, and it's really hard to see how that pivot is actually going to resolve the cost of living problem that most voters will
in the
be
short
thinking
term,
about
right?
when they go to the polls.
That doesn't. That's the inflation is now below the 0 to 3% band. It's 2%. Interest rates are well above the neutral rate, so the monetary policy settings are actually tight. So that, if anything, is going to get looser. So people are going to get more money in the pockets as interest rates drop. So the cost of living is going to become more affordable, particularly for people on mortgages, as their mortgages come up. The challenge may be some buffets from overseas as prices flip around due to some of these trade wars, but internally I don't think there's a lot of internal pressure for inflation. So the government has probably got more of a growth problem than an inflation problem to worry about, and I don't think they'll be worrying about rising prices this year.
Can we talk more about leadership matters? I'm not wanting to sort of start the usual, drum beating, but there's several issues around each of the leaders, and I'd like to just delve into them. Chris Hipkins must be pretty damn happy to have got this far after an election loss without there being any serious talk about his prospects. He's had that one-off poll where head-to-head with National, Labour got ahead. It's a much more complex picture, this electoral cycle, with the smaller parties being essential. Christopher Luxon, end of last year, there was a lot of dissatisfaction, around where National was, and there will have been a real reaction to that first poll this year. And then you mentioned Winston Peters. What are you making of the leadership side of things, Tim? Will it look the same at the end of the year as it does today?
Well, I think Labour hasn't got an alternative sitting there in the way that they had Jacinda Ardern when Andrew Little was the leader. That would look like the obvious alternative, but that it is a problem. So there's always the lack of competition, but also the issue is I think there's probably a recognition in Labour. The last time they were in opposition, they spent a lot of time flipping leaders, probably never gave them a chance, and probably the odds are that they won't win the next election. So sometimes someone's better to at least give them a crack at the next election, and then if you've got someone coming through, give them a fresh term rather than test them on this election. That would probably be a lesson. So I think those are probably the bigger challenges for Labour, is if you're going to change, what are you changing to? And until they find something that looks a lot better, I don't think they'll be in a hurry to do anything different.
You reading anything that's on your sites over the course of the year, Sue, or is there relative stability?
I think there is relative stability. I think that there's good, strong support around Chris Hipkins, and I don't hear any conversation about changing him as the leader. He's got very good, clear, crisp vision for what he wants to achieve for the year. They're going to have their debate about and get it out early in front of the public around tax. So I think there is going to be a really important juxtaposition this year between the let's sell our public assets to keep the country afloat agenda of the National Party, which is just so tired, and what they always roll out when they create the problem themselves of getting the economy in trouble, and Labour arguing around what you actually need what income you need to have a sustainable and a genuine growth agenda for the country. All so right. I think that's what needs to happen this year. I think that's the debate that's going to roll out. Who actually is best at simplifying their message and getting that nice and crisp and clear in front of the government?
Yeah, well, this is the thing with Chris Hipkins. He was the leader when Labour's recipe was fairly handsomely rejected at the last election, and this will get interesting as the head-to-head focus built. Let's go to the privatisation matter and just how this came out. I think it came out initially from the ACT leaders' State of the Nation speech, but the Prime Minister then did pick up and say that certainly didn't rule out the possibility of the next election bringing some privatisation possibilities. The interesting thing, Tim, apart from people saying what's left to sell, is that we have seen some quite interesting think pieces on how you might do this differently. And instead of just randomly, semi-privatising or putting a certain percentage of a state asset up to the share market, whether the government should think about something like the New Zealand First proposal, either of a fund or of a fund manager for assets. Is any of this going to gain any kind of steam?
Yeah, well, if we spend a lot of time talking about privatisation battles of the past, but the most recent one was, of course, the Auckland Council sold its remaining stake into a future fund. It sold the shares in Auckland Airport and put them into a fund for a more managed process, and that hasn't sort of ended the world. I think there is going to be some ideas around looking at the portfolio of what we hold, and we hold them for various reasons. The government owns 25% of Christchurch Airport now for some reason, which is probably worth $500 million. You've got to say, do you want to keep that money or do you want to be at a hospital? And that's the challenge, is what are we doing with all this capital? Why have we got them tied up in these businesses? Is there a more efficient way of managing that capital and redeploying it? And do you come up with something like a Temasek or an investment fund to manage those in a more professional rather than ad hoc way?
So,
yeah, I think it's about the government. The two leading parties are going to have a different view of how they gain the income. But I think Tim's right in explaining actually to the voting public, what is that for? Like, what is it that's going to actually improve lives for ordinary New Zealanders that is going to be worthwhile putting your vote towards? Because if people understand or are convinced about what the spend is, and if that is the right direction for the country, then that becomes the focus rather than how the income is being generated. So I think both parties will be pitching for that to be the debate rather than how the income is going to be generated. But there is, we've got very strong history in this country of how asset sales or carving it up in a different way has actually meant that some individuals have become very, very wealthy out of that exercise, but the country as an entire entity has become poorer. So how they actually overcome that debate is going to be very interesting to observe.
Okay, health, another headache. It's shot up the list of concerns and surveys for New Zealanders, and we know we had that move right at the start of the year to move the incumbent out and a brand new minister, but he's brand new to the portfolio in. Fairly soon after we had this Dunedin Hospital decision. Tim, how much of a headache is this ongoing stress the health sector is under going to be for the government?
Well, I think it's stress that is basically unsolvable, and every government's found that, because you can't ration healthcare by price. But there is a limit to how much resource we can put into it. The health system constantly needs more money because we are constantly developing new treatments. We've got a larger population, and you're dealing with massive resources and a massive sector that is, dealing with the issues of the population that need treatment. And medicine is just getting more expensive right around the world. So the political management of this is always a challenge. If anything, it's amazing how quiet it's been, but I think the pandemic probably covered it. But we had such a big restructure, I think it probably brought out a lot of the bigger problems. The government's changes probably signal that they need a tougher political manager in there at the front of that portfolio, but the problems haven't gone away, and there's the huge ongoing issues and the backlog of things like Dunedin Hospital was the first, but there's a lot of hospitals in New Zealand that need replacement or repair. And so this is going to be a big debate in the next decade as we try to work out what the priorities are.
So just thinking about the new minister, who clearly is very capable, that's why he's been put there, as well as multiple other portfolios that he's held. But just hear him saying that he hadn't read the Sapere report which of course has been, I think the previous minister had committed to in terms of trying to address primary and GP funding. This is a risk if he can't get quickly up to speed, right? Those frustrations are going to grow.
Well, we will find out if he's capable or not, because Simeon Brown's in the big league now. The politics within health are something that he probably hasn't grappled with in his life to date. I don't know that he's ever dealt with a unionised workforce, for example, in his life. And the health system is strongly unionised, and I think that he'll find that a real challenge. That he has been brought in because he's seen as being a tougher political manager. That means that he has been brought in to do the funding cuts, to make sure that the impact of the tax cuts then becoming funding cuts for the health system actually are meted out and are put in place. But, this is a sector that is going to be entirely wise to that. They will fight back very strongly about it, and I don't know how someone like Simeon, who hasn't encountered that sort of opposition before, is going to deal with it. So, Tim's absolutely right. The problem hasn't gone away. They've changed who's heading it for the government, but the problem that they have less funding to put into health because they have delivered those tax cuts. And people, to be fair to them, people voted for those tax cuts. What the voting public's now finding out is that there's a consequence to tax cuts. It does impact on your health system. It impacts on your education system. And I don't know that Simeon Brown's going to be the answer to the problem.
Let's just touch quickly on a couple of the climate-related issues that came out in the past week. The government's next tranche of climate targets post-2030 came out, and it basically said, well, it's enough. Opponents saying it's miserable. The projected cuts that it is proposing over that time frame. The minister pointing out that methane, agricultural emissions remain the main issue for us. We've got such a high renewable footprint already compared to many countries. How are you reading it, Sue?
Sorry, I missed that, Kathryn.
How are you reading it, Sue, the climate targets at the moment? Given the list of priorities among most voters, do you think the government will be able to argue for the target it's set for the next period, the post-2030 period?
Well, it's going to be very interesting to see how they argue for both that and their agenda that they're going very strongly on with the whole sort of let's mine our way out of this economic problem that we've created. So I think that they've got a credibility problem to start off with, and how they address that is they have to actually address that this year to have any credibility in that space.
Tim?
Well, I think one of the issues about economic growth and economic change is the opportunities around decarbonising the economy, looking at what the impacts of decarbonising the economy will have on our economic base, but also the opportunities. So it can actually create economic growth if we think more carefully about some of the potential climate change, the ETS, and it will drive behaviours towards those sectors of the economy that are more climate friendly. So hopefully that will actually become a positive for us. But I think the wider issue with the whole climate change policy and the Paris targets is probably a global issue around the credibility of those arrangements, now that so many major powers are just trying to foot trip them and knock them over and will not even accept them. Okay.
Let's finish with obviously a big week for the nation again, and for the start of the political year. We've got the oral submissions continuing on the Treaty Principles Bill. We touched on it last week. And also, of course, we have Waitangi Day. The ACT leader, David Seymour, as speaking to earlier, will be at Waitangi. The Prime Minister will be in Akaroa. Will it just be, again, another opportunity, I guess, for opponents of this legislation to state their case? And from the Prime Minister's perspective, Sue, for this again to be the issue that is constantly in the headlines?
Yes, well, by design, I don't know whether they intended it to be designed this way, but they have made the decision to have a lengthy process for submissions to be heard. So of course it's going to lead the political year, and because the political year always does kick off with ratana and waitangi, amongst other things, so it will continue to dominate people's thinking. And I think on both sides of the agenda, there is a lot of nervousness about, and nervousness is really understating it, about what this government has invited through its coalition partner, but what they've aided and abetted. Because I think both, obviously people who feel that the treaty as a founding document for the country is important, they're extremely upset about any attempt to rewrite and relitigate that. But also people who don't feel strongly about the treaty. I think there's a really strong cohort of New Zealanders who understand the importance of having good race relations in place and having a calm environment for race relations and not an enhanced, upset environment for race relations. So I think on both sides of that ledger, the government's in trouble, and the polling result, I'm sure, has convinced them of that if they weren't convinced about it already. One of the other problems for the government is that ACT has kind of outed them, if you like, because by going hard and fast on this, they've exposed an agenda that the national government, by its own admission, was going to try and address piecemeal by piecemeal and try and not make it a big issue as they usurped the impact of the Te Tiriti o Waitangi, one piece of legislation at a time. And what ACT has done is blowing that up. So, yeah, I don't know that they've got an easy way out of this. And for the government, sadly for them, the damage is already done. The mistrust has already been created, whatever they do next with this bill.
Tim?
I think the hidden agenda stuff, I don't agree with that. But look, I think the interesting thing for me is how much debate we're actually having. And we've seen some pretty impressive submissions. A lot of people are coming in and putting up the evidence and arguing it, actually getting live stream coverage of a select committee that's on wider media. Select committees don't normally get this coverage. A lot of very clever people who know a lot more about it than most of us, actually explaining some of the stuff about the treaty in a way we've never had. The history, the legal background has actually probably enhanced the debate. So people know a lot more about it. Doesn't mean that they've changed their positions, but we've now got a more educated thing. I think this is going to carry on. I suspect that the bill will get voted down, but then we'll have some sort of referendum, citizens-initiated referendum campaign. But I suppose if I'm trying to find a positive, is that the fact is the public is becoming a lot more educated about what we're actually talking about.
Thanks both very much. Sue Moroney there, or Tim Hurdle there, and Sue Moroney also our political commentators today.